Greetings and peace, everybody out there in the cosmos, sending love and light. This podcast episode is with Syed Muhiyuddin al-Attas, who is a young scholar from Malaysia. I sat down with him outside of Kuala Lumpur at the University of Life, which is a retreat center that his father founded. His father, the beloved, beautiful man, Habib Hussein al-Attas. And that retreat center is one of my favorite places on earth. We've done retreats there on Sufi poetry, on Rumi, on spirituality, art, and hopefully we'll do more in the future. But it's a place that I try to visit every time I'm in Malaysia, and Habib Hussein is one of my favorite, very special and unique individuals. And now I've met his son, Syed Muhiyuddin, a few times, and he's a young scholar in the philosophical school of Syed Naquib al-Attas. Syed Naquib al-Attas is one of the most prominent Muslim philosophers in the world, and definitely one of the most prominent thinkers in Nusantara, Southeast Asia. So we sat down and talked about Syed Naquib al-Attas and his thought. He recently wrote a master's thesis on the conception of the West in the thought of Syed Naquib al-Attas. And so we talked about that, and we talked about the influence that Syed Naquib has had on the West or on the East and the West, because he has also figured prominently in the development of the thought of some of the prominent Muslim thinkers in the West. And we had a great talk there at the University of Life. I was laughing to myself because obviously we hear a lot about Orientalism, which is this idea of the people in the West, Europeans and Americans, having certain conceptualizations of the East, the Orient. And, of course, Edward Said had the famous book, Orientalism, showing the certain stereotypes and certain tropes and things like that. But it's really interesting, if you think about it, this is kind of like the opposite of that. This is Occidentalism, right? In the sense that you have people's great philosophers, great thinkers from the Orient reflecting on the West and the thought of the West and the development of the intellectual history of the West and how that relates to Islam and Muslims in the East. So I think it's a topic that's very fruitful and really important. So we sat down and we had a great discussion. My friend Dustin Cron was also there, so you'll hear him. He was just quiet most of the time, but a few times in there he was like, he asked a few questions or offered some reflections. So that's the third voice that you hear there. We were in the jungle, so you're probably going to hear some jungle in the background. So before I give you the podcast, just want to say thank you to everybody for supporting. It's been really beautiful for me to see the podcast grow and to see, I get emails all the time of people who like the podcast or who like the specific one or who say they want a specific guest or a specific topic. If there's someone that you think would be great to have on the podcast, feel free to send me a message, connect@barakablue.com, and give your suggestions. I'm always looking for new, interesting people, and there's no shortage of those type of people. So let me know. I try to do the podcast as much as I can in person because there's definitely something lost, I think, when you do it over the phone or over Skype. But I have done a few of these over Skype, and a few of the ones that I have coming up are over Skype as well. There's certain people that it's hard to get in the same room with them. and I really want to have a conversation. So in lieu of the fact that I'm not able to be in the same room at the same time as them, I've done a few of those. But whenever I can get in the same physical space as someone, I prefer to do that. So, but yeah, anyone on earth that you think would be good on the podcast, feel free to send a message to that email. And also any topic, if you think there's a topic that would be good to discuss, feel free to mention that as well. And yeah, any other comments you have, I really appreciate people's comments and reflections. Even some people have sent me like critiques or concerns they had with some of the podcasts, so they didn't agree with certain things that were said. And that's cool too, actually. I appreciate that. And, that's to be expected also. I mean, my intention with the podcast is not to necessarily like advocate a specific paradigm or, but actually to have diverse voices and people that I may not agree with 100%, or people that come from different paradigms or schools of thought or backgrounds. And I believe that in the diversity of voices that there's something rich and something that enriches us. Even, and perhaps even especially when those points of view are different than our own. So, yeah, that's my 2 cents on that matter. Yeah, so, and of course you can keep supporting by word of mouth. That's how this spreads. And it's beautiful to see the listenership grow. And, I can tell on the SoundCloud where people are listening from. And it's literally like every country you could imagine. Maybe one of these coming up, I can read like the top 20 countries because it's like every continent. And some of them are kind of surprising and interesting. Yeah, and so rate it on iTunes and all that stuff. And if you have the financial means to support and you like what we're doing and you want to keep maintaining and growing, you can support on Patreon, which is our page, I think, is patreon.com/pathandpresent. And a lot of people that are supporting are just giving like $1 a month or $5 a month, which is awesome. And that's really great. A few people are giving more than that, a lot more. But those that are given, a small amount, or those who are like, yeah, I can't really part with $100 a month, don't think that you can't benefit. Because if everybody who's listening and who digs it and wants to see it maintain, supports with $1, would be smooth sailing, and I would not have to continue to even mention these type of things. But yeah, so if you can support. All right, listen, I'm gonna let you guys into the conversation. So here it is. Syed Muhiyuddin al-Attas. Assalamu alaikum. So basically, maybe you could tell us who is Syed Naquib al-Attas, and tell me about your research and your writing and your dissertation, your thesis about him.
Okay.
And his importance.
All right.
For Malaysia and for the world.
Inshallah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Professor Naquib al-Attas. Well, let me begin by my own studies of him. After I finished a first degree in politics and philosophy and economics from Otago University in New Zealand as a youth, and I think many people who are of my age struggling with our identity and struggling with modernity, as well as being Muslim within modernity, the students of Professor Naquib al-Attas and his ideas are unique. That is because not only are they able to present to us the meaning of the religion of Islam in a manner that is fitting for the modern world, but at the same time, they show a good grasp and mastery of also the Western intellectual tradition. So when I studied at CASIS, the center started by one Muhammad Noor, Professor Naquib's student, I I chose for my dissertation the study of Professor Naquib al-Attas's conception of the West. That is because amongst his peers, he has unique insights on Western culture and civilization. Professor Naquib al-Attas, in his youth, began his academic studies on Sufism as practiced and understood amongst the Malays. He focused his work on two of the greatest thinkers ever produced who wrote in the Malay language. And these are Sheikh Hamzah Fansuri and Sheikh Nuruddin al-Raniri. Hamzah Fansuri and Nuruddin al-Raniri were men of tasawwuf. And men of tasawwuf, but at the same time, the tasawwuf that they represent was in the same line as that of Al-Ghazali, Ibn Arabi, as well as taking into consideration the Persian intellectual system, the likes of Rumi, in terms of its allusions, Hafiz. These were all part and parcel of the systems of Hamzah Fansuri and Nuruddin al-Raniri.
And so what year did they live? Or what century?
These two, they wrote and lived in the 16th and 17th centuries. Hamzah Fansuri in the late 1500s, on the 16th century, and Nuruddin al-Raniri, he was the Shaykhul Islam, which is the highest position in terms of spiritual and intellectual leadership in this part of the world of Aceh between the years 1637 and 1644. So in terms of centuries, Nuruddin al-Raniri, which was the peak of the Malay intellectual tradition, were contemporaries with René Descartes of France, as well as Mullah Sadra of Iran, and Abdullah ibn Alawi al-Haddad of Hadramut. So you can see 17th century is the century where most of the traditions reach maturity. And the Malay intellectual tradition reached its maturity with Nuruddin al-Raniri in the 17th century. And Professor al-Attas began his studies with these two great thinkers. And in these two great thinkers, what he began to see, first through their system, was that they presented tasawwuf as a philosophical system comprising of a cosmology, of an ontology, meaning a discussion on existence, on the nature of its existence, and the nature of human psychology. And out of this, what he gradually discovered was that the entirety of the Malay world, and this comprised Malaysia, Indonesia, and all the islands of the archipelago, the Nusantara, that they all were undergoing a rapid process of intensification in terms of changes in their worldview or how they looked at the world. In particular, they were now struggling with the conception of existence. Initially, they understood existence as the Greeks might have understood it, in the idea that existence means to be in something. The Malay word for existence is to other, and for being as jadi, meaning to say comprising change from one state to another state, corruption and generation. But with metaphysical tasawwuf, what they gradually was undergoing was the understanding that existence need not necessarily be limited to what the language has conceived. And for this to happen, not only must their intellects grow, but the language needed to grow. And this was what led Professor Naquib al-Attas to formulate what he called the view of the Islamization of the Malay archipelago. And this Islamization meant that this language, which was initially a relatively undeveloped language used by coastal peoples for trade, would become a scientific language capable of discussing scientific and philosophical matters. Now, from these early studies of Professor Naquib al-Attas, gradually, by the end of his PhD, he had already formulated this idea about the Malay archipelago or the Nusantara as a civilization, possessing all the requirements of a civilization. And he also conceived of a center, an institute that would study all the elements that was necessary ingredients in terms of the continuity of this tradition. But somehow, along the way, we will see in the 70s, he published his, I think, in terms of international presence, his most noteworthy book, which is called Islam and Secularism. Islam and Secularism has been hailed as by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf at least as one of the most important works in the past century. This is because it deals with matters of prime importance. The idea of secularization as a philosophical program and how it impacted Western civilization and how through its impact upon Western civilization, it was gradually impacting all the other cultures in the world. And secularization, Professor Al-Attas here identifies as a problem, not necessarily because of its political aspect, the idea that of separation of state and religion, nor its economic aspect, the separation of church and society, but more fundamentally, secularization that he found problematic was the secularization as a philosophical program wherein nature became disenchanted of any spiritual elements. And it involved also the desacralization of politics. And it involves also the deconsecration of values. These three aspects made man the measure of all things. These three aspects also made, for the first time, catastrophe upon the three kingdoms of nature. Because now suddenly, man is understood as a separate being from the entirety of existence, having no connection whatsoever. And at the same time, having no connection with God, who is the creator and the sustainer and the source of values. So as a result, this new conception of science and conception of knowledge that was developing from the European civilization and gradually through colonization impacting the world, it was leading to imbalances in the ecological spheres, the economic spheres, the societal spheres, leading to gross injustices in the world. But his analysis in that work, Islam and Secularism, is not limited to just how the West underwent secularization, but explains this process vis-a-vis Islam. He said that in contrast to Western culture and civilization, the religion of Islam was not a cultural religion. Christianity, on the other hand, or rather how he understood Western Christianity, on the other hand, was a sophisticated form of a cultural religion precisely due to its historical circumstances. In particular, he has in mind the Latinization of Christianity, having shifted its center from Jerusalem to Rome, and the inward theological and political changes. So as a result, the secularization of the West is for him, although it became universalized, need not necessarily be something which was universal.
So in other words, the secularism is almost like a natural outgrowth of the nature of the way that Christianity or the teachings of Jesus were Latinized.
Yes.
So it was almost inevitable that it would lead to secularism. Is that what?
Yes.
So what are some of the ways that he argues that?
Well, firstly, it was because of the environment in which Christianity initially flourished. Remember that Paul was a Hellenized Jew, and that meant that in order for him to introduce Christianity, some of the earlier symbols of Christianity had to be presented in the Greco-Roman symbolic forms.
Sure.
And furthermore, Paul's break with the other students or disciples of Jesus meant also the introduction and the removal of certain aspects of the teachings of Jesus. In particular, we know historically, and not just from Muslim sources, that the introduction of Jews to the Christianity to the non-Israelis or the non-Jews meant the removal of the legal aspects of Judaism. Also, Christianity lacked the theological foundations that would characterize Judaism and Islam.
Right.
And some of these elements, alongside the development of Christianity as within the Aristotelian naturalism and rationalism, meant that somehow Christianity became fused with the existing culture and existing philosophies around it. But as the religion would develop and as it spread itself amongst the European peoples, more and more of these elements became, shall we say, more pronounced. And in particular, in the 13th and 12th, in the 12th and 13th centuries, with the contact with Islamic civilization, you come to see further developments of these Aristotelian elements within Christianity. So some of these elements, which are most natural to the development of secularization, according to Prof. Al-Attas, was the dualistic conception that somehow religion and science had to be separate. Religion and philosophy had to be separate. Where philosophical aspects of the religion is concerned, it is left to rational theology and gradually philosophy of religion. But religion, as it presents itself to the community, to the people, was done primarily through aesthetic means, primarily through the immediacy of the church, primarily through the means of plays and all these other aesthetic elements. Now, these are some of the fundamental elements that led Western Christianity, at least, to become secularized. And in the 20th century, their own theologians, the likes of Karl Barth, the likes of Paul Tillich, and the other, in particular, Protestant theologians, the leading German theologians also, they had the idea that Christianity needed to be de-Hellenized.
Right.
The Hellenic or the Greek elements needed to be removed from Christianity in order for it to return to the teachings of Jesus. But what can they fall on? Yes.
Right. And at the same time, the European thinkers who were trying to move away from Christianity were saying we can do that by reclaiming the legacy of the Greeks and trying to, and then this whole idea of the Dark Ages,
yes,
right? They say, oh, we went through the kind of Christian millennium, 1,000 years of ignorance because, locating this idea that the Greeks were the first scientists, the first rational thinkers and things of that nature.
Yes.
So, but just to for those who don't know the history, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm fascinated with early Christian history.
Yes.
But from my understanding, the early followers of Jesus were led by James, who, the first sources say the brother of Jesus. Perhaps he was a cousin or perhaps had some relation. But in any case, they considered themselves, the children of Israel. They considered themselves with following the Mosaic law.
Yes.
And they considered themselves those that just accepted Jesus as a Messiah, that came to challenge some of the ways that the community of followers of the Torah had kind of left it or had gone astray in certain ways. And so then Paul basically starts preaching, like you say, to the Hellenic world, outside of the Jewish community. And the historical record shows that Paul was actually called back by James to Jerusalem and questioned about some of the strange teachings. So it's argued that the idea of the divinity of Jesus and the Trinity and these type of things were actually Paul's creation, and a lot of it was, how do I speak to these people that haven't heard about Judaism, and how do I basically present the message of Jesus to them?
Yes, and these fundamental ideas, they seem to be in line with how the Quran presents the idea. You see, for example, the Quran says that the Prophet Isa, it is stated that wa rasulan ila bani Israel. He was a prophet sent to the people of Israel. Musaddiqan lima bayna yadayya min at-Taurat. His work is to confirm what is true in the Torah, and also to declare the coming of a prophet after him, whose name would be Ahmad. Now, Prof. Al-Attas, when contemplating this verse, he said that...
Just a second. What does that sound?
It's just the nature.
That's just the bugs?
Yes, these are the bugs.
Okay. They just got super loud. I was like, is that a machine or something?
Those are bugs.
Yes?
Can't stop that.
They're crickets?
Yeah, they're the green bugs. Yes.
Okay.
It is stated that they live for only a week in their lives. So, if you only live for a week, you better start screaming. Isn't it?
Praising God that whole week.
Right.
Loudly.
Yeah.
Either that or their mating call. They're trying to find a mate before they die.
Okay. So, yes. When it is stated there that the Prophet Isa alayhi salam was to declare the coming of a prophet after him, wa rasulan min ba'di ismuhu Ahmad. His name would be Ahmad. Prophet Al-Attas said that we know that prophets traditionally will have students around them, and students who have established relations, or disciples who have established relations with the prophets, we know that they're not just going to be, say, satisfied only with the name, without also asking for the description of the religion that would come, the man that would come. And this is how we know, and it is not too far to extrapolate, that from here, the disciples understood the nature of the final religion becoming a universal religion. And so it is that from these discussions or these ideas gradually arose the desire for some amongst the people who listened to the khabar or the reports from Jesus to want to develop a religion that was meant to the Banu Israel, the Israelites, to be developed into a universal force, and to somehow to compete with how God would intend for it to happen in the religion of the Prophet Muhammad. But since it was never meant to be like that as a divine message, as a result, the development became so unnatural that it was mixed with cultural, philosophical, traditional elements, such that this religion came to appropriate certain symbols which are not entirely their own. It came to appropriate certain epistemological systems, and by epistemology I mean the theory of knowledge. One particular statement that Professor al-Attas said, quoting their own theologians, was that as a result of the mixture of Christianity with Hellenic means of thinking, theology in the Judaic sense became stunted and restricted to the playpen of human philosophy and to the kindergarten of human thought. But an intellectual tradition, a spiritual tradition like Islam, on the other hand, with the Quran being reported tawatur, in the sense that it is reported by a group of people whom the mind cannot conceive that this group of people would purpose together upon the lie. The Quran was reported by a chain of Sahaba, through a chain of Tabi'in, and through a chain of scholars, such that we know that the Quran as we receive today is the actual Quran received by the Prophet.
Right.
And as a result of that, the intellectual tradition of Islam can develop from its own roots.
In a cohesive way.
Yes, in a coherent way, without undergoing some of these inventions or innovations.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because I would imagine, someone could ask, okay, Christianity comes into the Hellenic world and is deeply influenced by Hellenic thought. How is that different from the way that Islam comes into, say, the Persianate world, or Nusantara for that matter,
yes,
or other civilizations? Isn't it true that there is some type of interaction between the pre-existing intellectual world and philosophical world, and just the outlook and language, right? The
yes,
idea that language also contains a worldview. How is that different?
Okay, so the difference fundamentally is due to the nature of the Quran in itself. We now know that there is no extant copy of any of the statements of Jesus. If these are collections of the written documents, and we know that by the apostles, but nothing directly from the mouth of Jesus. But with regards to the Quran, at least where the intellectual tradition of Islam is concerned, no one can dispute that it is the actual word coming from the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
And according to Muslims, we say that even though it came from the Prophet Muhammad alone, we also affirm that it contains something which is in the nature of mu'jizah, meaning to say it weakens the argument of the opponent who denies that it is a message from God. The descriptions in the Quran pertaining to the reality and the nature of God is in his own words. Yes, we affirm the Quran to be God's description of himself in his own words. And it describes the relations between him and his creation. It also describes, at the same time, the ultimate end of man. So it has its own world view, meaning to say its own description of reality. And it is revealed in an Arabic, which is the Quran describes as غَيْرُ ذِي إِوَجٍ, a non-crooked language. Non-crooked means the Quran is a qawlum mubin. It is a clear verse. So the Quran as a whole and the Arabic that is used to support this divine discourse is what preserves the worldview of Islam intact. Now, when we say that the Quran became spread to different parts of the world, the process through which these other languages come to adopt and come to represent the reality as presented in the Quran. Now, this process has been identified by Professor Naquib al-Attas as the Islamization of a language, of a culture, of a worldview. And Islamization is defined here as the liberation of the mind or of man from an animistic, mythological, magical, and ultimately secular control of his reason and language. So this liberation leads man to return to his state of fitrah. And we also have an additional belief that the souls of man were created in a state of fitrah, meaning to say knowing of God. And this state of fitrah is affirmed due to the covenant that all souls of the sons of Adam sealed with God in the day of Alastu. This in reference to Quran Surah 7, Surah Al-A'raf, the verse 172, wherein Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said that وَإِذْ أَخَذَ مِنْ بَنِي Adam, we took from the sons of Adam, مِنْ ذُرِّيَّتِهِمْ, from his dhurriyyah or his descendants, and we brought them all before us. And Allah then said to them, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? And therefrom, the sons of Adam collectively answered, yes. And this answering, first, is a symbol that the souls of man already have recognized God. And this is this adds it to the significant statement by the Sufis who said that Awwaluddin ma'rifatullah, isn't it? The beginning of religion is knowledge of God. Some people take this to mean that you therefore must begin your study of the religion by knowledge of God. But in reality, the soul was created in a manner before its coming into this world has already known God. Awaluddin ma'rifatullah. The beginning of religion is already knowledge of God. So coming into this world, being brought into this world, our purpose is to return to our initial state.
Right.
Which
And
is
also,
our fitrah.
ma'rifah is different than ilm, right? And especially in the context of the Quranic really, story of humankind is that all souls were in the divine presence.
Yes.
So this was a knowledge of witnessing, ma'rifah,
Yes.
of experiential knowledge, of
Yes.
knowing Allah
Yes.
in an intimate way, in a direct way,
Yes.
not through hearing about it.
Yes.
So that at the core of our being, what you're saying and what Prophet Attas is saying is that we have this experiential knowledge of witnessing God.
Yes. Yes. And let me just add, the Malay word distinguishes between knowledge, which is al-ilm, and that which is ma'rifah. In the Malay language, we have for knowledge or al-ilm what we call tahu. Yes. And in the Malay language, the word tahu can be applied to most things, including that which is non-living. You can say you know of relations of things, its function, its uses. But when we talk about ma'rifah, which is illuminative knowing, which is experiential knowing, this can only be described of two living things, two intelligent things, two knowing things. Professor al-Attas has described this in an analogical fashion through a story about, supposing we wish to know somebody, a man who has just moved to our neighborhood. What we can discover through ilm or through knowledge is perhaps where he lives, the number of children he might have, and the sort of things that we can discover via observation. But for ma'rifah to happen, illuminative knowledge to happen, there needs to be at least 4 conditions that needs to be fulfilled. The first is that in terms of ma'rifah, the person who is to be known must have a desire to be known. If there is no desire to be known, then ma'rifah cannot happen. Secondly, there must be some similarity between the knower and the known. Because if you were to illumine something of your presence, of your reality, that person must be able to sustain it. That's why you cannot have, for example, ma'rifah when it comes to cats. I mean, although people imagine their relations with animals and pets because of familiarity over time, but real ma'rifah happens via disclosure. Thirdly, the relation must be of a significant time. And this is because time factor here is required for trust to be built. And then finally, the one who is approaching the person being approached, he has to abide by certain regulations and laws. It could be what has been set by society. It could be rules and laws of etiquette. It could be adab. Now, why does he put these 4 conditions in terms of attaining ma'rifah? It is so that we can have a sense of what it means for a human being to attain to the knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Firstly, where desire to be known is concerned, Prof. Al-Attas quotes the Hadith al-Qudsi, the divine hadith reported by the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, wherein Allah said, "Kuntu kanzan makhfiyan." I was a hidden treasure and I desired to be known. So therefore I created creation in order that I may be known. So this desire to be known by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also what led him to reveal the Quran through the Prophet. He was the one who gave us this great blessing to the Prophet Muhammad, and he protected it in terms of its veracity, its being unchanged, its unchangeableness, and its not changing. This Quran is a record of the conversation that happened between Allah and the Prophet, but since it is also God's speech, it is his continuous speech. So such that if the Quran talks about and he creates other things, that means he is still in a state of creating other things. So ever new things are coming into creation as we speak. Secondly, when it comes to similarity between the knower and the known, God said that although man is not God and God is not man, but yet we know that there is a divine spark within the human soul, and this is the ruh. And it is stated there, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew into the body of man of his spirit. And this intelligential spirit of man, the hearing, the seeing, and the knowing spirit has the capacity to know God through God's gift. And then thirdly, it is something which is established over time. And the person who pursues has to abide by certain rules and regulations. These are the Arkanul Islam and the Arkanul Iman, the foundations of this religion. Such that through long service of ibadah, eventually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will strengthen the trust which he has initially placed upon you. He purifies your soul, and the soul is likened like a mirror, until eventually he may bestow some of his ma'rifah. So these are the ma'rifah which we talk about, which I suppose protects the civilization of Islam from corruption, from coming into contact with other traditions. It does not mean that Islam was not impacted or does not utilize other traditions, because the Prophet himself said that wisdom is the lost property of the Muslim. Wherever he finds it, he should collect it. And you should seek knowledge even as far as China. But knowledge in Islam has always been understood in this twofold sense. One sense of the word knowledge means knowledge for pragmatic use, meaning to say knowledge of technology, the knowledge that would fulfill the requirements of the society, knowledge for living. And this kind of knowledge, we affirm, it is not found within the tradition of Islam alone. So that's why the Prophet said, seek knowledge even as far as China, because even during that time, it is known some of the technologies of the Chinese that were discovered. And that also may be the reason why the Malay world was known to the Prophet. Yes, the Nusantara was known to the Prophet because there's a product in Fansur, in present-day Aceh, in Barus, where Hamzah Fansuri came from, that can only be found and located in this region of the world. It is camphor, yes, kapo, Barus. So that's why in Arabic also we have the word for camphor, kafur. And kafur, here, what in Malay we call kapo, has this property that it is used to cover the sense of the dead. It is closely related with the Arabic word kufur. Kufur means to cover up the truth. And kafur means something that covers up a bad smell. And kafur, traditionally in history, in the records of trade by Al-Mas'udi and other geographers in the intellectual tradition of Islam, have consistently been located in this region. So we have good reason to assume and to believe that There is one statement in the oldest extant historical work here in this part of the world called the Hikayat Samudra Pasai. There, it is stated that the author says, Qala Rasul, the Prophet said. The Prophet said, although he does not provide a sanad for this, he said, the Prophet said, when you hear of a kingdom, yes, underneath the wind, or beneath the wind, below the wind, Samudra, its name, it says, prepare your equipments and start traveling there and spread Islam. From that region will be seen scholars as well as awliya. Now, historically, although there has never been scholars who have been able to find the sanad of this hadith, we know that historically this has become a reality through the founding of the Islamic civilization over here.
So, I think you point out something interesting, which is the idea that when I think Western people think about secularism, we think about, like you said, the separation of church and state, the desacralization of secular authority, because in many traditional societies, the ruler is seen as like a god or representative of God or the gods. And, you know, this comes as a reaction in many ways to, in Europe, the fact that people are fighting over religion and in many ways the papal authority becomes corrupt, and there's issues with people saying, okay, you can buy indulgences. In other words, you can buy your way out of hell if you pay and just there was a general level of corruption. And in fact, it seems pretty true that throughout human history, worldly power mixed with religion is a bad combination. Even in Islam, there's been very few moments, right? We look at, like, you know, the Caliph Umar Abdulaziz as like the fifth caliph, because around before him and after him there were a lot of people that weren't very righteous. So he stands out. I mean, even in the early period. Yes. But I think what you're saying, Syed Naquib al-Attas is highlighting is that secularism is only secondarily these things, but it's primarily a worldview, that there's certain philosophical underpinnings and assumptions about the nature of reality that secularism holds. And I think the average kind of Western person or the average other person would say, what's wrong with secularism? Because we want to all get along, right? We're going to live in these multicultural global civilizations. You know, it's hard if we govern society based on your religion or my religion or any religion, so let's just agree to separate it. But what he's saying is that the thing we need to understand is the actual philosophical underpinnings of secularism. Yes. Is that true? And if so, what are some of the unquestioned assumptions or the worldview of secularism?
Yes. The thing about the history of secularism, and this is something not just Professor Al-Attas is saying. Somebody by the name of Charles Taylor from McGill University, yes, from Canada, he has written a work called A Secular Age, in which he said that the secular age that we're living in is, as you described, it's not necessarily the loss of religion from society, because people are always going to be religious. But what he says is that now there's so many choices through which one can conceive of life, such that at least in the public sphere, you cannot think about one religion dominating other religions. Now, but let's just think again about this term secularism. First, in terms of where it came from, because it is inseparable from its history. In particular, because the term saeculum, which means the here and now, was a coinage, paradoxically, of the church. Yes, because they were in the past. They had two kinds of priests. There were the ecclesiastical priests, those who were who devoted their lives, such as the Benedictine monks, and the other orders that arose in the 5th and 6th centuries, yes, the Franciscan, the Dominican orders, the Mendicant and the non-Mendicant orders. These were the monks who were ecclesiastical in nature. They devoted themselves to the afterlife or living above this realm, which is considered for them as something to be denigrated. Yet at the same time, they were secular priests. And these secular priests, they deal with the secular people. And the secular people were the laity. The laity, because the French say, for secularism, they call it laïcism, meaning to say the laity, the common mass of people who were non-religious, who were, in a sense, whose conduct of life is worldly.
Right.
Yes? So as a result, when secularization became developed, I mean, already initially in these seeds, when it became developed as a philosophical program, all these roots are still part of it, but it's now become a tree. When you describe secularization, what needs to happen in our minds is to be able to see the entire history of the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, including also Martin Luther's activity, the rise of the Reformation, all these other processes in nature wherein the secular realm is now somehow opposing the powers that be. Included in this is the very interesting fact or the very interesting historical episode of the Copernican Revolution. Now, in reality, what was the Copernican Revolution? It was just a shift in paradigm in natural philosophy, a shift in paradigm in natural philosophy. But for Western civilization, it is much more than that. For them, the Copernican Revolution does not just mark the shift from a conception of the world which was geocentric, meaning to say the earth at the center of the world, to a heliocentric universe. It was also an attack upon the Christian churches. It was also an attack upon the church for trying to restrict the growth of natural science. So these are some of the historical circumstances that must be borne in mind when we discuss secularism. But where Islam is concerned, we see that in the Quran in itself, the study of nature is exhorted towards. At least the Quran highlights 3 grounds for research. First, psychology. وَفِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَفَلَا تُبْصِرُونَ. That you must study within your soul. The natural world are signs that you can know the signs of God. And then thirdly, history was also something exhorted to by the Quran. So basically science or knowledge and Islam is integrated. Now furthermore, when we talk about as you say, secularism having its roots in the political sphere, we affirm historically that because in the development of Christianity, it lacked a Sharia. And we said the Sharia governs every significant aspect of one's life. Due to its lack of the Sharia, the church system appropriated the Roman hierarchy, isn't it? That's how you have the papacy. The papacy is basically a reflection of the Roman hierarchical system, except for the fact that its powers are now growing because it extends even to the afterlife. So its growth was, so when you say, when the verse, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar and unto Christ what belongs to Christ, became popularized, this was not a statement of what is in fact the case, but rather an acceptance of the church or something utilized by the secular powers representing the status quo. But because if the church had its own way, it would rule both the ecclesiastical and the physical realms, because they were involved in sacralizing the rules of kings. They were the ones who appointed kings and deposed them whenever it was fit unto them. And they restricted the growth of science. They put Giordano Bruno on the stake. And many more of these episodes when science was trying to develop itself independently of the church. But when you look at the growth of the intellectual tradition and the spiritual tradition of Islam, despite the fact that, or in spite of the caliphs, as some of them were described in terms of their debauchery, in terms of their injustice that they perpetrated, some of them were the actual patrons of knowledge. Yes, Al-Ma'mun, Harun al-Rashid were the patrons of the Baitul Hikmah in Iraq. They sponsored the translation movement. They sustained the activity of the philosophers and the engineers, Al-Kindi as well as the Banu Musa brothers. The Banu Musa brothers were very unique combination of three brothers, because one of them was an engineer, the one was a physicist, and the other was a geometrician. So they worked together, making and constructing technological devices for the king. Now, but where the growth of Islam is concerned, remember that the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he moved from Mecca to Medina, that town, which was called Yathrib, due to the presence of the Prophet, took the new name of Medina. And what does the term Medina mean? Medina means a city or a place wherein deen is enacted, wherein religion is enacted. It's close semantic relation between religion and city. That means to say religion and city are inseparable. Why? Because the term deen, which Allah has chosen to reflect man's covenant and relation with God, or the word for religion here, already contains within its semantic content, its meaning content, first, the idea that living in a city is somehow natural to man. The term deen, we know, carries within it the meaning of indebtedness. Deen, as dain, means indebtedness. So, in a secular manner, when we talk about indebtedness, that means to say the society is complex enough. We're not talking about a village anymore. We're talking about a city. And the city has a ruler by the name of the Dayan. And this is what is characteristic of the lifeblood of the city, is what religion is about. So when we talk about the growth of Islam in history, religion and power was not separable. They are in fact twins. So I think we oppose the statement by, I think, Lord Acton, who said that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This because if this were true, then the most corrupt of all would be the most powerful. The omnipotent would be the most corrupt, isn't it? So in reality, power only corrupts the corruptible.
Yeah.
Or power corrupts the corrupted. Yes.
But like if you look at like all four of the founders of the four schools of law,
yes,
they all, I believe, spent time in prison during their life.
Yes.
And also, it's interesting. Like one of Allah's name is a Jabbar.
Yeah.
Which when it is a law, it's it's one thing, but when if a human being is a Jabbar, it means a tyrant.
Yes.
When it comes to Allah, it means the all-powerful. Yes. But it's this idea that a human being, like a corruptible being, like a human,
yes,
right? A fallible being can't necessarily carry that weight, Yes. MashaAllah.
What's really interesting in our time right now is, we see the end game of where this whole thing is at. 500 plus years of one world system, right? Because I think Syed Naquib's thought fits well with a lot of Latin American philosophy that has put forth this idea of global world systems theory. Manuel Wallerstein, right? And then the group of Latin American philosophers who have this idea of coloniality, modernity, right? That coloniality is the remnant of what the colonial world system has created for us. And so with that comes systems of power, systems of money, systems of government, systems of knowledge, philosophy, right, etc. And essentially what we've moved into is this age where there's a global war against Islam. Whether or not we want to call it that, at the ideological level, Islamophobia is so much about that.
Yes.
Really, it's about making Muslims question our identity.
Exactly.
Question our worldview and move further and further into a westernized worldview because a lot of this war is about, if the Muslims are the ones that are willing to live a traditional lifestyle, the most of any people left on the planet, then that's the group we have to bring in to this world system for it to be complete and for war to end, for history to be over, etc., right? And it's really crazy to think about where things are headed in the sense of technology. Because I think what you said is like, seek knowledge all the way to China, but I think Islam has always said knowledge with limits.
Yes.
And what we're moving into now is an age where knowledge has no limits. Technology has no limits.
Yes.
And so what's really scary is we're talking about people who could imagine living their entire lives within computers. This idea that I watched a film recently, and part of the plot was essentially that people die and their whole consciousness is uploaded into a computer system, and then that's heaven. And at the end of the film, this 80s song played that was like heaven on earth. That was heaven on, like this dunya heaven that's created in the cloud, right? Or like within technology. Yeah. And so what I see is that we're moving from secularism to a level of anti-humanism. Yeah. The powers that be are anti-human.
Transhumanism.
And then the subsequent part of that for a whole group of people is transhumanism. That we want to become one with technology. And for a lot of people, we have it in our lives, just the way that we interact with our phones, the way that we don't interact with books any longer. Yeah. And then these important philosophers are being lost. Even we see a generation of scholars who are in their 70s, like Habib, like Syed Naquib, who we're losing, and our generation we're not replacing those people, right? We see them as they're tied to the books, they're tied to the traditions, and we're tied to our phones and our computer screens, and et cetera, right? And so I wonder if Syed Naquib has talked much about like where things are headed in terms of technology and like the all-encompassing worldview that has become Western life.
Yes, he does say in an address in his acceptance of the Ghazali chair, which was awarded to him in 1995, I think, or it was in 1998. In there, he says that at the present juncture, and this was. He said at the present juncture, this was more than 20 years ago, I believe. He said that at this present juncture, technology seems to be determining a lot of things. But that does not. But Muslims, we are not accustomed to being pessimistic. We're always optimistic because we're the children of Adam. The one who was pessimistic was Shaitan. He was pessimistic of the mercy of Allah. So that's why that's his real mistake was this pessimism. The thinking that God would not forgive him, or rather it's arrogance preventing himself from repenting. But in the case of Muslims, we do know that despite whatever that they are presenting to us as the end of history, that it is not the end of history. Because when Fukuyama proposed the end of history and the last man, he seems to think that, well, history would end within a liberal democracy because, at least theoretically, according to him, it would represent the final stage wherein there is no longer any internal contradiction. But in reality, liberal democracy is a state of internal contradiction because we affirm that the human being is not solely his animalistic desires. We know that the human being will not be happy even if he were uploaded into a computer. We know that happiness means something else because our tradition of people, yes, Syed Naquib al-Attas and his forefathers. Remember that Syed Naquib al-Attas, even his direct grandfather, his Naquib bin Ali bin Abdullah bin Muhsin. Abdullah bin Muhsin was a wali of his time. Yes, imagine that, just 2 generations away, even his name was being given. So that means to say we're so close of even smelling the breath of the awliya in our time. And some of them are still maintaining the way of life of the Prophet and the generations that came after. So when we talk about the growth of world system theory and so on, but this is more like just the presentation of things to the people who don't know. That's why I remember there was one hadith wherein Sayyidina Umar al-Khattab was asking about the Dajjal. And then he asked the Prophet, well, what if we were to see him in our times? He said, you would play him like a ball. You see, this fear of the growing world systems only will impact and affect the Muslims who are not confident, who have not reached the level of certainty of their religion. And Prophet al-Attas, we can see his life's work is precisely to challenge these fundamental conceptions which were wrong. When he founded ISTAC in the 1990s, its fundamental goal is to clarify misconceptions pertaining to the religion of Islam. So that way people can always be brought to the watering place of the Sharia. So, and Islam has always been lived in history intimately and profoundly as a system as a whole. It encompasses ethics. It encompasses politics. There is no, it encompasses science, it encompasses religion. So that is why when you see wherever intellectual tradition of Islam flourishes, you will see works in all these departments. In the Malay world also, they wrote treatises on political philosophy, on economic philosophy, on epistemology and theory of knowledge, because and this is this is our presentation of disagreement with the people who affirm that we must take away religion from the public sphere in order for people of differences to exist. This is because the Quran, which is a divine revelation, already affirms the fundamental facts of difference. The Quran said it is we who created human beings, shu'uban wa qaba'il, that they are created in different tribes and races of people. Difference as a reality is affirmed in the Quran as a signs of God. So that is why wherever Islam went, culture is not supposed to be wiped clean. Language is not supposed to be wiped clean. Not even trees are supposed to be killed. And if this principle applies, that means to say if you were to travel to a place where the flora and fauna are different, that means to say they are meant to be preserved like that as signs of God. So that is why the Nusantara can appropriate Islam and still have its own characteristics. The Turkish can appropriate Islam and still have its own characteristics. The only aspects of things which Islam removes from the minds of the people, from the practices, are the practices which are corrupt in terms of belief, in terms of practices. Islam will remove those practices which will lead to the destruction of the community. For example, certain moral sicknesses within the community that needed to go away. But whatever that does not contradict the way of Islam. Now take, for example, when it spreads into China, there was a work that was done on how Ibn Arabi was integrated with Confucianist thought. Now, although we know that Confucianist thought is not really metaphysical in nature, but more ethical in nature, a lot of its ethics is in line with the intellectual tradition of Islam. Yes, the doctrine of balance, the doctrine of filial piety, so long as within certain limits set by Islam, is celebrated by the religion. And I'm sure even if Islam were to spread in Europe, and even though Prophet al-Attas has described that Islam and the West is in a state of permanent confrontation, what he means by that are not the Western peoples. What he means by that is not Western European cultures per se, not the Icelandic and the Nordic and the Celtic peoples and their ways of life per se. What he means by this permanent confrontation is the confrontation in worldview, where, for example, how he defines the West is that the West is described essentially, firstly, the one that relies on philosophy and science and empiricism alone as the route to reality. Secondly, the one that affirms dualism in its approach to reality, as if religion and science cannot be side by side, as if power and religion cannot be together, as if ethics and religion cannot be together. This dualism is what he attacks. And then thirdly, the humanism. We deny humanism as a philosophy. And for the culture that maintains humanism as a source of ethics, it will be in a permanent confrontation with Islam. And then fourthly, the tragic conception of life. And this tragic conception of life, you will see, permeates the entirety of Western culture and civilization from the Greco-Roman times, from Sophocles, his conception of Oedipus, to that of Prometheus, to that of Albert Camus's Sisyphus, to that of the Macbeth of Shakespeare, the Faust of Goethe. All these major figures have all been tragic figures because the West affirms tragedy as part and parcel of their life. And what he means by tragedy is not just that stage, presence, not just a literary theory. What he means by tragedy is something which is true and real in their lives. The one that denies already Iman as the road to safety and happiness. And so therefore they celebrate that life is inherently meaningless, that therefore it is filled with suffering. And since it is filled with suffering, it is something to be remedied. As Aristotle said, why is it that the Greeks want to watch the tragedy, and why do they put such a high premium on tragedy? Was because tragedy is the reenactment of a great person falling, and the emotion that you see through it is to effect a catharsis within you, because it evokes pity and fear, such that it ameliorates your own condition in life. It makes you feel better because now you see somebody worse than you being expanded like that. So therefore, that it is meant to somehow become like a cure for you for a while. But in Islam, this sort of pain and sickness, this depression and anxiety, and all the other disorders are meant to be combated by dhikrullah, by remembrance of God. This gradual remembrance of God brings about the state of calm and peace. Ala bi dhikrillahi tatma'innul qulub. Yes. Did you want
Yeah,
to?
because if you look, but on the other hand, and maybe this isn't different from what you're saying, if you look at these tragedies, particularly if you look at like Shakespeare, Goethe, and others, and perhaps you could argue this for many of the Greek tragedies, is that the purpose ultimately is through these characters to see the way, because some people do meet a tragic end.
Yeah.
And some, right, the hero with the fatal flaw.
Yeah.
Some people who are, and we see them every day, who have so many amazing qualities, there's certain qualities of their self or their nafs, which becomes an impediment for their true flourishing or true happiness, becomes their downfall. And so, I mean, many of Shakespeare's characters are really exploring aspects of the nafs and aspects of the self.
Yes.
Goethe was interesting because, he was deeply influenced by Persian Sufis, actually,
Yes.
like Hafiz particularly. So, the point of tragedy certain people meet tragic ends. But I guess what you're saying is to see tragedy as one aspect in light of Iman and understanding the purpose of existence.
Yes.
Right? And is that what you're saying?
Well, what I'm saying is that at least where the theory of tragedy has been formulated by Aristotle as part of his Poetics. Remember, this was in 300 over BC.
Yeah.
When he formulated that, it is not meant as a literary theory per se, because he describes now the condition of the person watching the tragedy, and its purpose as effecting the catharsis, and at the same time, the idea that the figure has to be a great man, and the language has to be enacted in a certain way, and the execution has to be perfect. And this execution, the point here is that there is a psychological function of tragedies, to the point that he rates tragedy as being superior to that of comedy. The lesser souls enjoy comedy, but great souls, they need to enjoy this tragedy, and they need it like a constant fix, like that for this something within their soul which is lacking. Now, according to Professor al-Attas, when he analyzes this theory of tragedy, in reality, who is this really great person who has a fundamental flaw and was brought down, and now in the second act, we are waiting until this reversal is to happen so that we can experience this catharsis. In reality, he says that this is the corrupted version of the story of Adam and his wife in heaven. And the Prophet Adam, remember, he was majestic, yes? Remember, the angels were meant to bow before him because of his possession of intelligence and language and the ability to order things according to name things as they are ordered according to existence. He was brought low by a fatal flaw within him, and this flaw was really because at the shall we say, because of lack of resolve, he listened to the whisperings of shaitan, and eventually made him to disobey God, being brought low, therefore, and now we are living in the second act, and we're waiting for the tragic end, like that. But this corrupted version is not the true version of the story. In the true version of the story, what happened? The fatal flaw that led to his fall was not the end of the story. The real end of the story was his repentance and his being brought back to greatness again. But because they don't possess that secret ingredient or secret ingredient of guidance from God, so therefore they maintain this state. the state of enjoying tragedy. What is wrong with tragedy is to think that it is sufficient for what you need. This Promethean spirit, you see, the West describes itself as Promethean, isn't it? Meaning to say, fighting dangerously against fate and the gods, protesting against fate and the gods. But while at the same time, in reality, it is more like a Sisyphus. In reality, it's just pushing the stone up the slope, waiting for it to fall, and then pushing it up again. This enjoying in this meaninglessness, and creating for the purpose of its life, this meaninglessness, this tragic. This is more like a quicksand of tragic reality, and it is the kind of suffering that sometimes can be remedied by watching great pieces of tragedy and watching Macbeth and so on. But in certain other times, if the suffering was too strong, the Greeks have another word for it. If the suffering was too strong, it will result in sparagmos, not tragedy anymore. And sparagmos is this idea that we have a Malay word for it. It's called amok. I mean, it's to run amok, to be in a killing spree in order to resolve this pain. And for Professor Al-Attas, he sees this as part and parcel of the Western culture and civilization that is dominant today as what you call world systems theory, that they are trying to spread to the world. They tell you that if you suffer depression, you can take a pill. They tell you that what you need for happiness is the pursuit of social status. They tell you that what you need for happiness is to become famous. But we know this as you say, the tragic characters in present day world, they are real. They are not literary figures anymore. They are the comedians and actors of the world that are propped up in society, but they suffer tragic fates when they take their own lives. But Islam brings a solution to this that does not require these tragic consequences. So that's why we say this: Islam and the West is in a state of permanent confrontation. We don't mean by that the political confrontation. Nor do we mean by that the militaristic confrontation, although historically that was the case. We know that the rise of Islam challenged the dominance of Christianity as a world power. And for as long as Islam survives as polities, the world system, as you say, will continuously try to suppress. But the confrontation is coming from the West towards Islam rather than the other way around. And wherever you see the promotion of Islamophobia and the extreme reactions of some amongst the Muslims, these are really the, shall we say, reactions as opposed to something which is integrally within the worldview of Islam. Because where Islamic civilization is concerned, there were many instances, in fact most of the instances, where it's not equally met with military confrontation. The Malay world is the perfect specimen. Islam came here with not a single bloodshed. Yes, no swords were drawn. Those people who came via trade routes, they were not traders, they were professional missionaries. They came here and they set up Islamic kingdoms. They converted the kings, and the kings, upon conversion, agreed to sponsor the Islamization movement, such that the Javanese island became Islamized from Malacca. And this process of Islamization is continuous until today, even despite the presence of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Spaniards, the British, all these European forces that has come to colonize, yet Islam remains the religion of the locality.
And now,
okay.
And now that's not to say that the West is winning, right? So to say that this worldview is dominating the Muslims. I think that it's the opposite in many ways, right?
Yes.
The Muslims, Islam will always be an alternative for those who want to come into a holistic existence of humanness, right? Whereas I think that there might be these people attached to these machines and totally that their consciousness is, so to say, in the cloud. And in the meantime, the Muslims will continue existing. There may even reach a point where people may not die, technically, like where they can figure out how to surpass death, quote, death, and the Muslims will keep dying, right? Because the Muslims will keep living a natural worldview. And so in that way, the best that we can hope for is that people can exist side by side and the Muslims continue to...
Yeah, so in that vein, what do you see now, like in the future? What has happened since Syed Naquib al-Attas has been teaching for many decades?
Yes.
what is his legacy like presently in Malaysia and then beyond, and then what do you see for the future?
Well, for one, at least in the particular Malaysian context, and many other Muslims who are from other parts of the world who are now observing the Malaysian context, what he has awoken amongst the Malays is a civilizational consciousness. The notion that Malaysia as a country, maybe 60 years in terms of its independence politically, but in reality, it is a continuation of a civilization that has existed for hundreds of years. He has left behind ISTAC, yes, the Institute of Islamic Thought and Civilization, which is meant to address the world in its present state. It is meant to address the best philosophies of the West, the best philosophers of the West, the scientific tradition of the West. Have you seen the library? It houses more than 140,000 volumes. When he said that there's 140,000 volumes in this library, many people say and ask, what, 4,000? Because it is uncommon for something like that to be built here. Of course, there are bigger libraries in other parts of the world, but for him to accomplish such a deed within 10 or 15 years, now that's something. And to be able to train the students which are capable of sustaining his conversation is another thing. And furthermore, despite his growing age, he's now 86. He was born in 1931. He's still writing. And just 2 years ago, in 2015, he published a book on justice and the nature of man, which is meant to combat the dominant worldview about the nature of man today, which is the anthropological, the evolutionistic, the naturalistic picture of man, wanting to return man to the special creation that he is. So he's challenging the ideological control. He's still performing the art, the decolonization, the de-westernization, and the Islamization of knowledge. He's still performing that because he has liberated his mind. He's managed to see the world as how it was intended by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the creator of the universe. And we're not worried about those people who think they can extend their lives into computers for, say, the next 10 or 100 years. Because we know that this world, this realm that we're talking about was not meant to be a permanent realm. It is a temporary realm. It's a realm of testing of your resolve in terms of your faith. Now, in terms of the legacy of Professor Al-Attas, there still needs to be, in our time, the university that he has in mind, that teaches the proper conception of knowledge, and that continuously de-secularizes, decolonizes, and de-westernizes knowledge, but while at the same time inculcating authentic knowledge. And the measure of authentic knowledge is that it leads to happiness. It leads to what it's meant to be doing. Now knowledge has lost its purpose. What Professor Al-Attas did was to bring back the purpose of knowledge. The purpose of knowledge is man to know himself, and the purpose of man knowing himself ultimately is to know God. And to know God means to love him and to live one's life as a shahada.
MashaAllah. So where can people that are interested in reading his works or reading works about his life and legacy from his students, what are some good resources to access that?
Well, his students, they run a center called CASIS, Center for Advanced Studies on Science, Islam and Civilization. It's housed under UTM, the Technological University in Malaysia in KL. They run an annual program called the Wise Summer School. It runs for an entire week that gives an introduction to the entirety of his thought. And at the same time, they also they sell his works also there. So, look out for Wise Summer School. And it runs yearly or annually in usually in the months of July or August. Yes. And it's conducted in English, of course.
Alhamdulillah. Well, thank you for your time. Inshallah, we'll explore the University of Life a little bit more.
Okay.
And we look forward to reading your thesis about the life of
Al-Attas' conception of the West.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing that. Reading that.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Path and Present podcast. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so in a few ways. One is word of mouth. People hear about the podcast mostly from people like you who listen and like it. and say, I know someone who would connect with this, or who would feel this, or who would enjoy this subject matter. So continue to share with your family and friends. Secondly, you can subscribe, rate, and comment on the iTunes page of Path and Present. Subscribing means that the podcast each episode will come directly to you when we release it. And rating and commenting means that it will grow and come up in the iTunes rankings, which will allow it to be available and seen by more people. And then lastly, you can support financially on Patreon. Patreon is a site which allows people to give a small amount monthly to support art or any type of content. And we have a Path and Present page on Patreon. The link is on our SoundCloud page, SoundCloud/Path and Present. And you'll find the Patreon link there. And yeah, you can support there. We're greatly appreciative of it. I guess lastly, keep us in your prayers, your positive thoughts, and your moments of remembrance. And thank you for tuning in and being part of the global Path and Present family. One love.